that you, if you haven't read Stalin's work on the same topic that was released a year or two before Lenin's that we're about to read here today, you should read that. That is more fundamental, and you should go back and read that. That'll help you to understand a lot of the topics and concepts that we're talking about here. And some of this I'll skip over so that we can get to the debate between Luxemburg and Lenin. And I'll begin here. Which reads, first of all, was the debate with the Polish Social Democrats led by Rosa Luxemburg. In fact, I'll go back one or two paragraphs here. Lenin explained that the right of self-determination is a democratic right, not a socialist right. Therefore, the right of self-determination should always be subordinate to the labor question, that is, to the class question. Throughout the history of the Bolshevik Party, Lenin always explained that the defense of the right of self-determination was the best way to guarantee the unity of the working class. The unity of different nations within one single state will only be a voluntary union. This position was approved at the Party Congress in 1903, but this article in the party program, Clause 9, this is the fundamental thing, the fundamental clause here. What is my button that I use? Is it that button? Clause 9, to provoke lots of polemics over many years, even after the October Revolution. So then again, we get to the debate between Luxemburg and Lenin, which is fundamentally what the right of nations to self-determination is all about. First of all was the debate with the Polish Social Democrats led by Rosa Luxemburg. The social democracy of the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania, or the SDKPIL, sent two visitors to the 1903 Congress with the aim of conducting discussions leading to unity between the parties. However, the Fourth Congress of the SDKPIL earlier in the same year had passed a resolution which had put forward certain conditions for this unity to go ahead. One of those was to replace the clause of the party program, Clause 9, on the right of nations to self-determination, quote, by a precise formula incapable of interpretation in a nationalist spirit, and, quote, autonomy to be demanded for the Polish and Lithuanian provinces, specifically. And this is Rosa Luxemburg. Hi, Rosa. Well, generally, this is a polemic against Rosa Luxemburg's position on the national question, but she's generally pretty good. We've got no problem with Rosa. No hate. The program commission discussed the question and kept the original formulation, which read, right of self-determination for all nations included within the bounds of the state. This was then adopted by the Congress. The two Polish delegates then left the Congress, making a statement to the effect that unification will become possible only if the Congress adopted their wording of the clause, or if it left the question open for further discussion. The position of the Polish Social Democrats was then defended by Rosa Luxemburg in a series of articles in which she rejected the slogan of the right of nations to self-determination. She argued that, in the epoch of imperialism, this slogan could not be carried out, and that in any case it was the slogan of the bourgeois nationalists. Working-class socialists should instead stand for class unity, not separation. While rejecting independence for Poland and Lithuania, she nevertheless agreed with advocating their autonomy. Lenin replied extensively to these arguments. To a certain extent, it was understandable that Luxemburg, as a Polish social democrat, would stress the need to not make any concession to the Polish bourgeois and petty bourgeois nationalists, some of which attempted to give themselves a socialist coloring. Whether or not Polish social democrats should argue for Polish independence or not was something which could be debated according to concrete and specific circumstances. However, Luxembourg and those who shared her views were demanding that the Russian Social Democratic Party should not defend the right of nations to self determination. That was wholly incorrect. Lenin said that the main task of the great Russian Social Democrats was to fight against their own bourgeoisie and their own ruling class, which was guilty of oppressing the Poles and other nations. And therefore, they had to guarantee and agitate for the right to self determination. That was the only way to show the Polish workers and the Polish masses in general that the Russian Social Democrats had nothing to do with the great Russian ruling class, which was oppressing them. Excuse me. The task of the Polish Social Democrats was slightly different. Their main task on the national question was to fight against the Polish bourgeois and petty bourgeois, and against any attempt to put the national interests of Poland above the class interests of the Polish workers. And then he goes on to describe the imperialism and the so-called ultra-left errors of Bukharin, which I think we can skip over and talk a little bit about the Russian Revolution, which occurred after the writing of this work. However, this work played a fundamental, I think, role in many of the successes that I guess were enjoyed after the Russian Revolution. The question, it reads, of the democratic demands of the oppressed nationalities played an important role in the Russian Revolution, both in February and in October 1917. This was the case particularly in Ukraine and Finland, but also Poland, Georgia, and Central Asia. In 1916, for instance, there had been a mass uprising in Central Asia, mainly of the Kyrgyz and Kazakh Muslim peoples against conscription into the war. Here you have Lenin reading the Pravda. In the period between February and October, there was a lot of agitation again around this question, particularly in Ukraine, Poland, and Finland. The provisional government was brought to power in February as a result of the abolition of Tsardom and was meant to carry out the bourgeois democratic revolution. But just as it was unable to carry out other democratic tasks like land reform, a constituent assembly, etc., it did nothing to satisfy the national aspirations of the oppressed, even though the national democratic movement in most cases was also dominated by the bourgeois liberals. Once the Bolsheviks took power, they immediately began rectifying this. Less than 10 days after the October Revolution, the Council of People's Commissars, headed by Lenin, issued the Declaration of the Rights of the Peoples of Russia on the 15th of November, 1917, which stated very clearly its defense of, quote, the right of the peoples of Russia to free self-determination, even to the point of separation and the formation of an independent state. This question, like all the others the Bolsheviks faced when coming to power, was not a simple, straightforward one. The national question and the national aspirations of the oppressed peoples became completely enmeshed in the question of foreign intervention and the Civil War, with foreign imperialist powers cynically attempting to use the national aspirations of oppressed nationalities against the October Revolution and Soviet power. Nevertheless, in the first few years of the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks fulfilled their promise to the oppressed nationalities and put into practice the principle of the right of nations to self-determination. 5 independent republics were recognized, including Finland, Latvia, Ukraine, and Georgia. In addition, 17 different autonomous republics were created within the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the RSFSR. And I believe that'll serve as additional context for this work, the rights of nations to self-determination. Stick around for Chapter 1. Chapter 1 on the right of nations to self-determination. What is meant by the self-determination of questions. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to support. There's different ways to do so. You can support with a subscription on Twitch. You can support on Patreon with a patronage over there. You can tip directly as well. Cash App, Venmo, the other one, and my @ is iDan Simpson. Okay. Love your face. If you're watching live, stick around. We're going to get right into chapter 1. If you are watching the replay, why don't you go ahead and click that button and listen to chapter 1.